obrigada por estar aqui conosco essa manhã, sobretudo após a performance de ontem, que eu tive a oportunidade e a felicidade de assistir. Quando fui convidada pela equipe do MIT, eu entrei em contato com o seu trabalho. E de cara assim, eu me identifiquei bastante com o seu trabalho por conta da questão que ele traz e as possibilidades de relação com o Brasil, né? Porque você está falando de uma viagem, de uma jornada da diáspora. E o Brasil foi um dos mapas principais dessa jornada, né? Então, assim, para a gente começar a conversar com você, e você trazer um pouco dessa experiência do seu trabalho, do processo. Que motivações foram essas? Essa menina, jovem atriz, performer, que resolve empreender uma jornada, mas numa outra época, no sentido, vamos dizer assim, contrário, né? Uma jornada ao revés, mas para fazer um trabalho de denúncia também, né, sobre as estruturas do racismo que permanecem, a despeito de estarmos vivendo uma sociedade profundamente diferente daquela em que essa aventura marítima começou. Então seria assim muito interessante que você pudesse falar um pouco da tua experiência, de como que foi essas motivações para a criação do SALT.
Okay. Thank you. So, I can still hear you. So, before I started on Soul, I did a project called Dark and Lovely, which was about black women, black men and their hair. So I went to lots of different hair salons for like 6 months, and I was working in them, learning how to do the hair, and interviewing people on what their hair meant to them. And I noticed that with the people I'd been speaking to for a long time, there came a point where we weren't talking about hair anymore. What we were talking about was what they thought blackness was and what they thought blackness wasn't. And this was really, really interesting to me. I was kind of obsessed by it. And I really wanted to try and understand this. Blackness is such a slippery thing to hold on to understand ontologically. And I really wanted to. So I started reading and trying to. I grew up in a family that was very pro-black. So my dad was like a British Black Panther. There was a lot of kind of pan-African literature in my house growing up. And then when I kind of went to school and went to uni, I moved away from that. It wasn't very cool anymore, so I left it. But then Black Lives Matter kind of started in the States. And Black Lives Matter sort of sister movement sprang up in the UK, which I was a part of, and was suddenly aware of the relationship between police violence in the state and police violence and violence within jail systems in the UK, the violence of immigration. And I was angry, and I was watching lots and lots of art about race that felt very problematic, very grounded in very racist ideas, but was positioning itself as anti-racist. And I was so full of anger and so full of her. And so I started reading a lot of Afro-pessimism. So Afro-pessimism, broadly speaking, is 2 theories. The first being that anti-blackness is global, and that it kind of holds all of us ontologically in place. So the black as the slave, the colonised as the sort of savage, and then white people as master, as human, and that this is a global thing and it holds all of the repressions in place. And this other idea that I was much more drawn to as an artist, which was this notion that slavery, colonialism were the end of the world and we live post-apocalypse. And I found this comforting and compelling, but still just didn't feel like there was anything I could do that was big enough for the grief and the anger and the pain that I felt. So I decided that I wanted to do that void. I think initially it wasn't even about retracing the triangle. It was about being in the middle of the triangle, being as close to the bottom of the sea and the people lost to the Middle Passage as possible. But then that grew into more of a journey, and I knew I wanted it to take place at sea because I wanted it to be laborious, I wanted it to be a pilgrimage, I wanted it to open up space for grieving and contemplation over a long period of time. And I think it was as much about creating a rite of passage for myself and releasing some of that feeling as it was about making an artwork. But also I feel like it is easier to see all 3 points of that triangle from a distance. It's very difficult to see the UK from within the UK. It's very difficult to see Ghana from within Ghana. So it was about how can I create the distance to look at these 3 things, but also embody this sort of diaspora feeling of nowhere quite fitting. And I've talked for ages now, so I'm going to stop.
Não falo muito, ainda temos pouco mais para falar, porque esse tema que você traz também se liga pouco com esse sentimento de não pertencimento, né? E aí eu vou trazer para essa conversa uma poeta que você gosta muito, que é a Audre Lorde, que fala desse lugar, né? De sentir-se estrangeira em sua própria pátria, em seu próprio território. Na verdade, eu acho que isso é um sentimento que passa por todas nós mulheres negras, homens negros, né? Sentirmos-nos pouco apartados do que muitas vezes nos concedem como uma ideia de nacionalidade, pertencimento. E você, num texto, na sua performance, no momento você fala, I am a black British. Então, de que maneira também esse sentimento, essa percepção de que, ao mesmo tempo, não fomos destinadas a sobreviver, como diz lindamente Audre Lorde em seu poema, mas, ao mesmo tempo, esse sentimento de estrangeira, de não sentir-se participante, né? De não ser integrada. Em que medida isso afeta também a sua performance, a sua jornada?
Yeah. So I find the label Black British really weird. For me, it's like the best of a bad bunch because I feel like the perception of blackness in the UK is still firmly entrenched in the other. Obviously, you are the other, and it's still a status that is deeply bound up in immigration. So it's presumed that either you are an immigrant, your parent is an immigrant, or your grandparent is an immigrant. And there's a very specific relationship, I think, that the British, with its kind of empire hangover, has to immigration, and who should or shouldn't be in the country, and who should or shouldn't have access to the wealth built up by centuries of violence. But my parents that adopted me were both born in the UK. So for me to try to claim any other place feels colonial. It doesn't feel right for me to try to claim Jamaicanness, even though ethnically I'm Jamaican, because I've only been there once for this project. And there are people that live there and have whole lives there, and their relationship to Jamaica is so distinct from mine, so how can I claim it? I feel a great deal of ambivalence about claiming Africanness. So, in the UK I'll have friends who were born in Ghana or Nigeria or Sierra Leone or Senegal, or they have parents from there, and their relationship to Africa is very, very specific because the proximity is so much closer. Whereas for me, the proximity to Jamaica is kind of snapped by immigration, and then the proximity to Africa is snapped by immigration and snapped by the Middle Passage. So I'm left with this feeling of like floating, like having always been in Britain, but always having this ongoing feeling of not being wanted there and of being rejected there, and also of wanting to disavow Britishness because I associate it with violence. But it gives me a certain amount of privilege, right? There's a lot of privilege in a British passport, in a British national insurance number, in all of the wealth that goes with being a citizen of that country. So I can't disavow it, it's not right. But none of it fits. That's my defining feeling as a part of the African diaspora, that nowhere really is quite home. And maybe that's because the way that we understand home needs to change and is changing. Like, I think there's a Stuart Hall quote where he says, when somebody asks me where they're from, I expect to have a long answer. And I think that that's going to become like increasingly true for more people than not. But also it's like what is promised by the notion of home, what is promised by belonging somewhere. And have I answered the question? Is that all right?
E aí eu queria que você pudesse falar um pouco da companhia dessas mulheres que você traz, além da Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, essa companhia maravilhosa que durante o espetáculo de ontem é como se víssemos elas se materializassem também na sua performance. E em que medida essas mulheres que trazem essa experiência também do deslocamento, elas contribuem para o seu trabalho, para a sua criação.
So, I read Sister Outsider when I was 24, and it changed my life. Like, I think it's the single most like pivotal book I've ever read. Like, it makes me feel quite emotional to think about it, because there was all of this language, all of these images, all of these words that articulated things I had felt all my life and never been able to express. And this was coming from a lady who I think died when I was 2, who grew up in America and was of a different ethnicity from me, but she got it and made me feel very free. And part of the reason why my nan is so present in the work of Soul is because she is a woman that I felt very much, to be with her was to be at home. And there's an idea that I find really compelling, that I'm interested in, which is the idea of like leaving behind national ideas of blackness and thinking about global ideas of blackness and how we stand in solidarity with each other and how we connect through differences. And I think that there's something that writers are very able to do that. So Saidiya Hartman, who again is a massive presence in Seoul, kind of, and was a big part of me being like, I can physically do this journey. It starts at the Hole, starts in Elmina, and traces the slave route back into Ghana. And she speaks about the perversity of this action, that she is excavating a wound rather than healing it, and kind of trying to get right into the heart of the pain so that she can sit with it for a bit and just allow it to exist.
Porque o texto da Celina é uma obra à parte, né? Quem tiver oportunidade, não sei se está publicado, Celina pode falar sobre isso, mas é um texto poético, é um texto para a cena, mas ele é um texto poético, então ele tem uma vida independente. Ao mesmo tempo, tudo o que ela traz no texto, na dramaturgia do texto, a gente vai assistir na performance, na cena. Então, eu acho que é interessante para nós que também trabalhamos com essa linguagem do teatro, e sobretudo quando a performer é a própria dramaturga, né? Como é o processo de construção. Você escreve primeiro, você vai escrevendo ao longo da experiência da criação na cena. As imagens que você traz para o texto são as imagens que vão povoar o seu trabalho em cena, e seria interessante ouvir você falar um pouco sobre isso também.
Yeah, so I've been making that for about... Sorry. I've been making work for about 6 years. So my practice still feels really chaotic to me. But I'll just tell you about how I wrote Soul. The great thing about being at sea is that you get a lot of time to just write. That's all there is to do, is write and read. I wrote probably the most I've ever wrote. I was able to write for hours and hours every day, and I call that process just dredging. So like big old streams of consciousness and little drawings and diagrams and images. So I had the image of the soul very early on. I knew that I wanted there to be some big task that I was doing by the end of the show, that it would start with something that was big and insurmountable, and by the end it would be dust. And I initially wanted it to be like a chunk of salt this big, and my designer was like, no. So we refined that into something a bit more realistic. When I got off the ship, I had a month to make the first show, and all we had were diary entries and streams of consciousness. So I worked with 2 dramaturgs. The first was an academic who knew a lot about Afro-pessimism, also sort of queer versions of Afro-pessimism as well. So she was there very much like refining the rigorousness of the ideas, like, let's pull this out. Is this problematic? Is it problematic but you're going to stand by it? You need to go and read this, you need to think about this, you need to watch that. Rigor, discipline. The other dramaturg was a woman who has been working in theatre for a long time. So her thing was much more, yeah, but someone's got to sit and watch this. So it needs to have a journey, it needs to be compelling, it can't just be academia, because no one's going to watch that, no one's going to care. So how do we bring your emotions into it? And it all comes out in fragments. So I think the first thing we did was I just kept telling people the journey from start to finish. I think there were like 4 afternoons of just being like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And people noticing what kept coming up, or what felt compelling, or what produced a particular emotional response. And then we made it into the first version, which was like chaos. So like, I think before the show opened, I rewrote the script, and I was on stage with it, and I was kind of like, and it was all really raw, and I was really tired, and my body hurt, it was a mess. Then we had another period of writing with somebody who said, let's look at this in terms of the 7-step narrative structure. How does that then work? And we did it that way. Pardon me. It's a very Western thing, that narrative structure. So it was interesting. It was a more compelling show, but some of the politics was lost. So then myself and my producer spoke, and I was kind of like, I need a year to ignore this work and to grow up, because it was this massive, massive journey, and it opened up loads of stuff in my life, and that stuff needed to be worked through before it could be a show that people could experience, rather than just someone's emotional vomit because they're still processing. So I ignored it for a year. Then I had a 6-week writing residency. I can't remember much about that other than being stressed. I think I sat for like a week and just like looked at the structure and was like, this is a monster. And then was working with those dramaturgs again, and also a couple of artists who hadn't seen it at all, but who had been in dialogue with me while I did the journey. So we kind of broke it all apart and then put it back together. And then I worked with a director, which I've never done before. So was able to like go through it line by line by line. What does this mean? What are you actually trying to say? And all of this is like supplemented by like a really rich body of reading. So like all the Afrofuturism I can find, writers like Nalo Hopkinson and Octavia Butler, but also poets. So sort of like Nayyirah Waheed, Audre Lorde, Morgan Parker, because I wanted it to... Nayyirah Waheed was like a really big early inspiration. She has a book called Soul, and it's a book of poetry that's like, each poem is like 3 or 4 lines long, but she is able in those 3 or 4 lines to like communicate some like heavy stuff, but also she's able to communicate that heavy stuff with the precision that she does, because she knows exactly who her audience is. She knows that she's writing to other people in the diaspora, so she knows that words mean very specific things from that context, and I really wanted that for the text a lot. So it's this big process of like refining, of taking 2 months and kind of like gradually, essentially over 2 years, removing until you've got this 1 hour, which is the essentials of it. For a theatre show, if it were a book, it would look different. I think I did answer the question that time. I feel confident that I did.
Fiquei curiosa para saber um pouco mais como que é a aceitação, pensando na Inglaterra, do trabalho de artistas negros, e como que foi esse processo dela conseguir, por exemplo, ter uma visibilidade como artista lá.
Thank you. Take this off. So I think that I'm really lucky, because in the past 3-4 years there's been a real big push from the Arts Council, which is the big public funding body for the arts, to improve diversity within the arts, which means that there have been pots of money for artists of colour. There have been lots of schemes, so like a big push for artists of colour to be at things where they can speak with international programmers, and it's opened up a space where we are able to have discourse, where we are able to talk about the fact that after a big sort of push in the late 80s, early 90s for work from black artists, all that money disappeared, all that visibility disappeared, and communities of colour in the UK have been underserviced by the arts sector. and so the show comes out of that context and has benefited from that context and was responded to really well. But I'm also aware of the fact that, so we were at the Edinburgh Festival, there are about, how many shows are in Edinburgh every year? Like I think it might be a couple of thousand shows that are there, and 100 of those couple of thousand shows came from artists of colour. So it's like, it's still a real problem, and I think a big problem that we have is a lack of black leadership. So there are, and that's changing, so there are maybe 3 or 4 companies in the UK that are led by black artists and make work that centre those experiences. But there are very few of the big theatres or the big funding bodies that have that kind of presence, and that's where you're able to make the change. It's the people that have the money and making producing decisions that are able to really make the long-term sustainable change. So I feel like we're in the middle of a process of campaigning which feels positive, but I have concerns. I have a real concern that there will come a point when it's not fashionable anymore, when the Arts Council isn't putting money into it anymore, and all of that support will disappear. And I also worry about tokenisation, and I worry about that thing where where a few individuals are made exceptional, are made very, very visible, but at the cost of lots of other people being made invisible. Yeah. Okay.
Vocês, na Inglaterra, como um movimento de artistas negros, justamente para que se sustente essa possibilidade de se fazer arte, vocês têm uma organização do ponto de vista, pode ser sindical ou uma organização informal, mas um tipo de organização que possa garantir a continuidade disso?
These are excellent questions. So in short, no, nothing as organised as that, nothing like a union. Because we should be amazing, but it's also, all of that is labour. Who does that labour? Who has the time and resources to do that labour? That's what seems to keep coming up. I also think that historically what happens for black British artists is that they're able to find platforms abroad. So what tends to happen is a black British artist will get to a certain place in the UK, at which point the UK will go, that's enough, so they have to go to America. And that's where they go and build their careers. And then when they are hugely successful, you know, being nominated for Oscars, then the UK is like, oh, come back, we'll have you now. But they're not willing to do that work in the middle. And I think that there are theatre companies, so Eclipse comes to mind, who are doing lots of work. So they have a big project called Revolution Mix, where they're placing black artists in big theatres across the country and giving them big commissions, and it's spread out over a long period of time. All those artists at the end of it will have development. They will have had a big, high-profile show. They'll have been able to disprove the myth that black work is a risk, that it doesn't sell, that it doesn't make any money. But what I hate is that it always comes back to who has the money to support it, who will catch that. And I hate that because it's really disempowering, and I don't know how I both get around it and do the work I want to do, which is make art. And I also don't want to get in that weird little pigeonhole that I think can happen to young artists of colour, which is before they even get a chance to go out and make their work and grow their practice and develop a voice, they're expected to do the work of diversity and fix a load of institutional problems that have been around for decades. But at the same time, you want to make things better in the industry, so how do you how do you balance those two things? How do you pace yourself? And how do you prevent burnout as well? Because I'm aware that when I speak to artists who are the generation above me, that's what they speak about a lot. That half their generation burnt out or disappeared.